And that is that by the very early part of this century, it became clear that what was happening to coasts was only an expression of something much, much, much bigger. And the announcement was made by some wise people that we had left the Holocene and had entered a whole new era in the history of our planet called the Anthropocene, a time when it is human beings that are, and what human beings do, that is driving ecosystem processes at the scale of the entire planet. And that we have entered an era where looking back to what's happened in the past is going to have limited value in telling us what's going to happen. In other words, the future is not going to be a projection of the past. This has been shown many times in many ways, that you can pull together the information that shows the enormous increases in CO2, which is changing the climate, the greatest extinction of species since the time of the dinosaurs, this massive and rapid increase of the human population, and now human beings adding more biologically available nitrogen than all of the natural processes on the planet, which has particular impacts on coastal areas and now dead zones, eutrophication, and so on. So if one absorbs that message, then you find yourself asking, well, is this really still about management, or is it something else? And if one thinks about it, one says, okay, management is the process by which we assemble resources to achieve a known goal within a known institutional structure. So we manage a school, we manage a factory, we manage a war, we manage a political campaign. And we're all pretty good at that. And we know the rules, we know the goals, we know how to organize. Governance is rather different. The crucial point, to me at least, in governance is that you go back and you say, what are we really trying to do? What really are the goals? What is it that is most important to us? And rethinking all those things that are otherwise givens under management. So governance sets the stage within which management occurs. In the Anthropocene, I think clearly what we attempt to do along coastlines is a matter of governance now, not mere management, as it was in the happy days of the 1970s. So, coastal ecosystem governance, and there are many definitions of this, but one that I particularly like, and fortunately one can pick and choose which ones you think speak to what you are trying to do, states that we don't know enough, and thank goodness we're not powerful enough to manage ecosystems. What we can and must do is manage human behavior, human activities. So the focus shifts. Much of CZM and ICM was about let's understand nature, let's understand all these processes, which you must do. But the focus really needs to be on how do we deal with human behavior, and by these activities that are leading us to a definitely uncertain and quite likely not very positive future. So coastal ecosystem governance is a response to the Anthropocene. So one then needs to ask oneself, well, what really is governance? What does it contain? And this is one way of answering it. It's the rules by which we function as a society, what we decide is acceptable or forbidden, how we reward and what we reward, what we punish, what we praise, and what we say is not something that we should do. Now, a crucial learning there is that governance is not government, that there are really three sources of governance, three principal sources: markets, government, and civil society, and they work by quite different tools and mechanisms. In places like the US, places like Europe, in dealing with coastal issues, government is a key player and an obvious player. But in many parts of the world, government has almost no role or is very weak. And it becomes clear that it is markets that are really driving what is happening. And civil society may or may not be playing a role. The idea that comes when you look at things this way is that when you are concerned about stakeholders' involvement and so on, you need to think about where's the power, and the hypothesis is that you need to engage all three of these mechanisms if you're really going to rethink and restructure your governance system. So this way of thinking then suggests another framework. The ICM cycle is about process. It's about organizing all those activities that can lead you to political decisions and to some level of change behavior through implementation. But you can have a very nice process and still not get the outcomes that you desire. So that suggests that maybe a conceptual framework for process needs to be complemented by a framework for outcomes. And the basic idea is that you first have to be clear-headed about what direction are you trying to help a coast and its people move towards. And I'm calling that here, oh, I didn't change it, sustainable ecosystem development or ecosystem stewardship. But that is a very distant goal. I think that more pragmatically, what we are all trying to do in various ways is to define specific environmental and human qualities and goals that we want to reach. We call that the third order. Define what are the changes in behavior that are needed to reach those ends, and then, very importantly, what are the enabling conditions? What do we have to do to create a setting in which those changes in behavior will happen, which will lead us to those ends, that then if you repeat that many times and maybe solve your water quality problem and solve your fisheries problem and solve your equity problem and solve whatever else, you then may move over to that fourth order. So in this way of thinking, and I'll go through this quickly, one needs to think through with the people in some place where you are working, what are those qualities that over the long term we are hoping to achieve? Then get specific to whatever problem or issue it is that one decides to work on, and define outcomes in clear, hopefully measurable terms. In ecosystem governance, the hypothesis is that you have to define goals both for the environment and for people and work on them simultaneously, because the two are interdependent and linked. That's quite different from much of what has happened in both CZM and ICM. That the changes in behavior that need to be thought about and acted upon fall into three large categories. One is the changes in behavior of those who most actively using the place. An example, dynamite fishing. One needs to think about the institutions and what changes need to happen there to get you towards your goals. And then, of course, you need to think about the patterns of investment. In other words, market, civil society, government, and think your way through with the people in some place as to what do we need to do and how do we do it. But most crucially are the enabling conditions. And the hypothesis that we have been working on with a number of people in a number of countries is that if you are going to get to implementation, to the second order, at any meaningful scale, you need to assemble four things, and you need all four of them. The capacity to practice this kind of work, the constituencies that support it, yes, the commitment to provide the authority and the resources over the long term to implement it, all of which driven by clear goals. So you put it all together, and this framework looks something like this, rather like the framework at the beginning of what is a coastal ecosystem. It needs to be a nested system that spans scales. And ideally, what happens at the municipal level is supported and reflected by what happens at the next scale up, the province or the state and the nation and the region, and in the Anthropocene all the way on up to the global. The implications of this way of thinking is that the transition is the implementation gap transition. And that means really focusing on those first order enabling conditions, which is not where we have traditionally focused. Engaging all three mechanisms or sources of governance, thinking very carefully of what are we going to monitor in order to assess whether we're winning or losing, and encouraging a culture of learning. The contributions of science to all of this are terribly important, but not enough. It is not science-based management. It is the contributions of science to engage in a governance process that I would suggest is the nature of the challenge. So as we sum this up, looking back over all these decades, what are we learning or should be learning? That it is changing the behavior of institutions and groups. That's the heart in the Anthropocene, in particular, of our practice. That governments have a very important role, but by no means the only role, and in some cases a rather minor one. That engaging those three sources is critical. That the reason that we are not doing what we want to be doing and should be doing is not that we don't have enough science. It's also very likely it's not that we don't have enough money. It's that we're not organizing and defining the problems in an appropriate manner. Why? Because we really don't know how to practice this kind of long-term thinking and action, and the capacity to do it is largely absent. So once again, it's about bridging these two columns of knowledge and thought, bridging that gap. And I'll just end by suggesting that I believe that we do know enough now to do much, much better than we are doing. What we need to do is to rethink how we go about managing our investments and managing our efforts. I think that we would be hugely helped if there were places in each region that people could go and see, like experimental farms, where long-term efforts are underway, where you can look at the evidence, where you can see where these ideas are being implemented. Call them regional networks of reference sites. In the US, at least, we learned in agriculture that if you're going to change the behavior of farmers, you have to link research with education, with practice, with actually doing it, and have a back and forth between those who you were trying to help and to change and an academic institution. I think we would be very well served if we had such centers around the planet. And above all, perhaps we have to invest in the university and school curricula that promote this way of seeing and promote this way of understanding how we change our behavior. I think that we could, within a few years, break the cycle that we're now in and actually have the constituencies and have the political will to do what needs to be done, which quite obviously, at the moment, we are not doing. Thank you.